Once again, content creators are ruining Pokemon Unite, but this time, luckily, it's not me. Hi everybody, Jake, your resident content cowboy here, and let's get right into this. Is Chris a pro? If he's a pro, I don't think he has the right to show off enemy favoring builds when he keeps spreading trash tier builds every time. The comment section is full of defenders for some reason, but if a Japanese pro put out a build like this, they'd get absolutely roasted. Well, they say randoms overseas are low quality, so maybe he can even win with this build. The build in question here and what has sparked the controversy is this video. Hilarious outplays on the thumbnail with Big Root, Potion, an Eos Cookie, and he's playing Cut, Feint Attack, Zoroark. I have a lot of thoughts about this. I think this is very interesting, and I'll tell you exactly where this came from. A little earlier, Chris had posted on Twitter a picture of a gold badge Zoroark that was running Wise Glasses and Leftovers, which of course is very, very bad, and I think this just highlights the fact that you can really get a gold badge with anything. It just means you have played a lot, you can get master rank with anything. These are all things we know, but for whatever reason, this sparked some people, especially some players from Japan, to start criticizing the builds from Chris, and I think there is some really interesting stuff going on here. A tale as old as time in the content world is that you are never allowed to post something fun, you are never allowed to post something even pretty good. It's either you're posting the most meta thing, or why would you ever post it? And then if you're only posting the most meta thing ever, you're getting a lot of comments like, why won't you play anything but the meta? It is an unwinnable situation as a content creator, and when you are playing the game day in and day out, you're going to try some builds. You're going to try different things. You're going to see what works, especially when new items come to the game. I want to talk specifically about this build. I want to talk about content creation as well. I want to talk about good builds versus bad builds. I want to talk a little bit about the irony of players from Japan talking about bad builds, because they are a really interesting region when it has come to builds for a long time. I think interesting is a fun word to say there. So let's get into it. First, let's just talk about this build right here. The build is Eos Cookie, Big Root, Resonant Guard with a Potion. We've got 6 white, 6 brown for the emblems, and the emblems are focused less on giving you more attack and more on giving you some more HP with a -2 special attack, right? So this is set up to be a Zoroark with a ton of HP and to attempt to leverage the move Cut to get more HP from your opponents with Big Root, right? So the more HP you have with Eos Cookie, the longer you will be in some of these fights, giving you opportunities to use Cut again and again, get more and more HP. Big Root gets more HP off of your Cut, and it also increases the Potion. Resonant Guard, I have to assume, is just there for an extra shield. It's based off your max HP, so Eos Cookie kind of combos with that, right? And it also gives you a lot of flat HP as an item. There's probably, like, if you were to break this down, it's probably much more beneficial overall to swap that Resonant Guard out with an attack weight. You might even get more value slightly out of something like Focus Band, but it might not be entirely necessary. So that is the build that we are talking about right here. Is this build the most meta build? I will say, to be fair, we don't know. He doesn't present it as it's the most meta build, and my take would be no, this is just kind of a fun, cheesy build with some things to consider inside of it, but it mostly looks like kind of a fun build that you would play in ranked. I'll talk about why that's, you know, something that happens here in just one second. Comparing the two builds, one is objectively bad. It is Wise Glasses Leftovers. I guess at least you get something out of Leftovers. And the other is cheesy. I think that's a pretty fair way to look at it, right? It's interesting to me that we have players from Japan getting upset at Chris over a build like this, because as I mentioned a little earlier, Japan notoriously has had some pretty wild builds. I think if you are making content for the game and you are playing for long enough, you're going to start experimenting, you're going to start trying things, and through some of this experimentation, you will find something that is very meta, very good, that some other players would not have noticed. For instance, from Japan, I think we all can remember the Rocky Helm Gyarados that a lot of people were scratching their head about, and then all of a sudden realized, oh, actually, the way this item is triggering, this is a really great build. And it looked like a troll build at first, right? Then you think about other situations where a build in Japan, Another one that springs to mind, and I'm not trying to call anyone out here, but there was a pro player on the team that won Worlds, if I'm remembering the year correctly this happened, who was playing a curse item on Tyranitar, and it essentially doesn't work on that Pokemon. It essentially does not help much at all because curse damage doesn't proc on true damage, so you're really losing out on so much by using this item, and that wasn't something that player or that region knew too much about. In fact, throughout the history of Unite, Japan has not been particularly great when it comes to item builds. I think there's been a lot of confusion around it. I don't know if they have the same kind of resources we have with Unite DB and stuff like that, or maybe they do now. Anyway, the point of this is, I do think it's kind of funny coming from Japan, who often has some wacky stuff that eventually does or does not become meta, that some of those players would be upset at Chris for a build that looks pretty, yes, cheesy, I think is a fair way to say it. But the real question here is, what are you supposed to test? What are you supposed to play? What is a fair build to bring into ranked? And is it true that you could just muscle your way through a lot of these builds? What is the point of a good build? I mean, there are so many questions really that I think you have to answer with some of this. There is no question that this isn't the most meta build and it isn't presented like that, but how detrimental is it to run something that is slightly off meta, especially if you are a quality player and you know how it works? Well, for the case of someone like Crisheroes, I don't think that's very detrimental at all, but I think there are some factors that play into that. As mentioned in this tweet, if a Japanese pro put out a video like that, they'd get roasted. I don't even know if they really would, to be honest. While they say the randoms overseas are low quality, maybe he can even win with this build. That is something that is without question true. However, I will take some issue with this. I do think EU as a region is extremely weak. I think North America is very weak as well, especially over the last year and a half. I think it's gotten weaker and weaker with the matchmaking changes. You are often in games with players that have extremely low skill. So if you're a high skill player, even if you're playing something cheesy, it doesn't seem to make too much of a difference. I think that's fair. Also, I have to say, every time I go to Japan, I play solo queue out there. Multiple times I've been to Japan, I've played solo queue and I've recorded it. I've put it up on my channel. I think they're generally a stronger region than every other region in the game right now, which is mostly due to player base. There are tons of games that I've recorded in Japan that are just as chaotic and bad as solo queue games in NA. However, with more players, you are going to get more higher skilled players playing. And when I do play in Japan, I often run into players that are on pro teams and stuff like that. So I think their top tier players are playing more. To generally say they are a better region, I think is 100% correct. And to say that their solo, queue, duo, trio is stronger, I think that is correct too. However, I still think their lobbies are filled with low tier players also. And from what I've seen in Japan, most of these top players are playing in duos, trios, things like that. So they're stacking the matches in such a way that they're going to have great games regardless of what they are running. However, I will agree, it is a stronger region to play the game in. As we go further into this back and forth on Twitter, Chris is just kind of saying, what are you talking about? And the player is saying, how can you be the one posting tons of videos with weird builds, yet when you actually get a teammate with a weird build in a match, you call them out? Whether or not there's meaning behind it, calling both weird builds is the same thing either way, which is without question not true at all. There are builds that are less meta, or builds that you're experimenting with, or builds that are just kind of fun, and then there are things that truly don't work at all. And I do have to say, if you're a great player, it doesn't really matter. There was a series I did where I climbed to master rank with no items and no emblems, and I did that for a bit of a challenge, but I also did it to prove a point that you are able to win these games because you outplay your opponents in the match. If you're 3 levels higher than your opponents because you're out securing them and out fighting them in all of these moments, your item build is relevant, but it's not as relevant as the skill that you bring into a match, the decisions you make in the match, your macro choices, all of those things. And to look at both of these builds, one that is kind of fully trash and one that is actually intentional but mid is disingenuous. These are very different things. Every time something like this comes up, it really just goes back to this idea that content creators have so much influence over the game and also no influence over the game at the same time. You could make 100 videos about the things you would like to see changed in Unite and nothing will happen. However, if you post a build where you're running Muscle Band on Blastoise when maybe Slick Spoon would have been better, you are a toxic element that is poisoning the player base. I will say a player like that Zoroark who's playing Wise Glasses Leftovers, who could use an actual build, is not watching content anyway, so I do think it's a little irrelevant. However, there is a fine line, and it is tricky when you're making content. What is good and what is fun or kind of okay, and where do you draw the line on what is acceptable and what is unacceptable? For instance, I think playing Sableye without EXP share is unacceptable. I think playing Comfey without EXP share is fully trolling and unacceptable. These are kind of lines that I can see, drawing lines in the sand. However, if you want to try something weird in a third item slot on a Pokemon because you understand how that item works and you have a plan around it, I'm not super stressed about it. I'm not. But there is another great argument. If you are loading into a lobby and you are looking at your team and they are playing this Zoroark build, are you happy? And I think the answer is generally no. You see that and you think, wow, this is not going to go well unless the player's name happens to be Crisheroes. Chris responds to some of these Japanese players calling him out by saying, Japanese players thinking I wouldn't be able to pull off these builds on their server is kinda cute. I think it's funny. He's going at him a little bit. He also goes on to note that he has a lot of respect for Japan. The thing is, Chris is a great player. He's a great player. He could be a professional player if he wanted to be. And to be fair, when you compare Chris to other professional players, no one is being more professional with Unite than a player like Chris, right? He plays this game professionally, just in a different respect. He also was a former professional player, but it does beg the question a little bit. Is the build good? Is the build mid? Is it fully troll and he's just muscling his way through it because he is that good? I do think that's a fair question. However, as a content creator, as a pro player, which he is, I think you have to spend time trying to figure this out, or we wouldn't have Rocky Helmet Gyarados. We wouldn't. I remember when Dodrio dropped in the game. People thought it was terrible, and they might have thought it was terrible for a long time if there weren't players out there willing to try to figure this out and make something like this work. Is Big Root Zoro going to be a thing? I highly doubt it, but there could be something that is found with some of this content that would never have been found otherwise if you only have to play the most meta thing. There have been so many items, so many builds, so many situations that have been found by sort of a wild pro player or semi-pro player, someone competing in the tournaments, by a content creator, by people breaking down numbers and things like that. I think all of that is important, and it's all an important part of the conversation, especially if you're not advertising something like it is the greatest thing. If you say new best build, this is incredible, and it's this tank Zoroark, well, then I think people probably have a little more room to criticize. But I think you're allowed to post something fun, something different, something that has a specific play style. I do think that's pretty fair, but it's also pretty fair to get some criticism for it. I know there have been many builds that I have gotten criticism for. One of them that I got the most criticism for happens to be the current best Blastoise build. There was a time where you couldn't say Rapid Spin Hydro Pump was good. People were actively upset about it. And now it is recognized as the best Blastoise build in the current meta. Things like that happen. I don't think we'll be seeing that with the Zoroark, but I do think it's always an interesting conversation. What should a content creator post? What is a good build? What is a fair build? What is a mid build? What is kind of a cheesy build that works? And is it relevant to play something like that? Or relevant isn't even the right word, but is it reasonable to play something like that? I think with the current state of our ladder, I think you can play things that are fun and have a concept behind them as long as you're good enough to play them. I do think a lot of the time people aren't good enough to play them. So what do you do with that? I don't know. I want to hear from you in the comments. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. What is the cheesiest build you play? You can let me know that as well. My overall take on all of this is, if you find a build that is good and working and you understand how it works, that is a fair thing to play, especially in the latter state of Unite. And I have to agree with Chris. I think if he went over to Japan, he could smurf on their ladder with this build as well. Maybe he would run into more opposition. I don't even want to say maybe. I've played on EU as well. He would run into more opposition, right? I've played on like every region that I've traveled to. And yeah, he would run into stiffer competition in Japan. But that doesn't mean that he wouldn't be able to dance all over them with this Zoroark build. I would honestly, at this point, love to see it. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for listening. I love you. I'll see you next time. We did it.